welcome to Jay Coletti's Racket Reviews. My name is Jay Coletti, and I will be your hostess. Here on Racket Reviews, we are dedicated to learning about all things organized crime, and I'm really looking forward to another individual study with you today on this very special 50th episode of Racket Reviews. In celebration, we're going to be focusing on not only Chicago's most famous, but the world's most famous mobster, Al Capone. We're going to take some extra time to talk about Big Al today. He was certainly captivating, media-driven, and something about him was just extra special. So I can't think of a better candidate for the 50th episode. If you're enjoying the channel and would like to become a Racket Reviews patron, please head on over to the Patreon account and join the Coletti family. Now, without further ado, grab a snack, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. We have much to discuss, so let's get right to it. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in Brooklyn, New York on January 17, 1899, to immigrant parents Gabriele and Teresina Capone. He was the third of the couple's 9 children and the first to be born in the United States. Vincenzo, Raffaele, Alphonse, Salvatore, John, Albert, Matthew, Rose, and Mafalda Capone made for a big family. The family lived in a New York tenement on Navy Street like many immigrants at the time, and Al Capone grew up having very little. His father was a barber and his mother was a seamstress. For many years it has been reported that his parents immigrated from Naples, Italy, with his father being born in Castellamare, but according to the family records, it would seem that Al Capone's heritage is from Angri, Italy, where his future Chicago outfit successor Frank Nitti was born. The story of having Napolitano origins actually seems to derive from the fact that his father was a barber. It was assumed that this same trade was performed in Italy, and since Naples was under the control of the Camorra and had to pay protection there, and likely in the United States as well, especially in the Camorra-controlled section of New York where they were, it made for a compelling legacy to have Capone's origins steeped in criminality. However, by tracing back Capone's heritage to his grandparents, we find that his heritage is that of Angrese pasta makers. His grandparents, Vincenzo and Marcia Calabrese, owned a pasta shop in Angri where they sold their goods. His father, Gabriele, would work in the family business as well until he found work as a lithographer. Likely for his work, Gabriele moved to Castellamare di Stabia for a few years. He returned by age 25 and settled in Via Concilio with his bride. He and Teresina Raiola, the youngest of 4 daughters of a farming family, had married at the Church of San Giovanni Battista in May of 1891. After giving birth to Vincenzo on March 28, 1892, the family wanted to make a better life and moved back to Castellamare di Stabia before deciding ultimately to move to America. When they arrived, their surname was listed as Capone, likely a mistake, and was later corrected to Capone. Once in Brooklyn, the couple gave birth to Alphonse in 1899. Gabriele would obtain his United States citizenship in 1906, even though Capone would later lie, telling everyone that his parents were, quote, American-born, and so was I. Al Capone attended Brooklyn Elementary School, now William A. Butler School, until 6th grade. It is here that many believe he first met his lifelong counterpart and oftentimes criminal associate, Salvatore Lucania, better known as Lucky Luciano. Other reports claim that the boys attended Public School 7 in Brooklyn, now Abraham Lincoln School. It is worthy of note that Public School 7 is closer in proximity to Navy Street. Apparently, up until 6th grade, Capone had been a good student, but became involved in street gangs, very likely working with Luciano, causing his grades to drop and requiring that he repeat the grade. As a member of the youth gang called the Boys of Navy Street, Al Capone was quite rambunctious. As early as 8 years old, we have stories of him in gang conflicts. In one example, with a group of Irishmen who had been harassing some of the Italian women in the neighborhood. The boys started a street battle by sending Al Capone with a washtub strapped to his chest that he beat like a drum outside of an Irish hangout to taunt them until the rest of the crew showed up for the fight. If Al Capone's life hadn't gone on to be such a Shakespearean-level tragedy, this story might have been kind of adorable. Maybe it still is. By the age of 14, he would drop out of school due to a combination of the humiliation of repeating the 6th grade and the physical confrontation with the teacher. Capone was often subjected to being called racial slurs and physical abuse at his school. When his teacher struck him for misbehaving, Capone struck her back. This got him sent to the principal's office where he received a beating. After that, he left school for good and never looked back. By this time, the Capone family had moved from Navy Street to a home in the Park Slope neighborhood of Brooklyn. Although Capone's father had wanted his sons to follow in his footsteps of learning a trade and earning an honest living, the Capone name would soon be seared in the minds of not only Americans but the world as synonymous with organized crime. While living in Park Slope, Capone would meet his future wife, Mary Coughlin, and future criminal mentor, Johnny Torrio. Torrio was busy running gambling operations near Capone's home and would hire Capone to run errands for him. Some of these errands weren't even illegal. He seemed to be testing out his future right-hand man. The two would become fast friends and trusted confidants before Torrio left for Chicago in 1909 to help Big Jim Colosimo run his brothel empire in the Windy City. With Capone's involvement with Torrio and other criminal gangs, including the 40 Thieves Juniors and the Brooklyn Rippers, he would begin earning a name for himself and work with men such as Lucky Luciano, Johnny Torrio, and soon Frankie Yale. His work in crime really would not take off until he got involved with the 5 Points gang, through which he would meet Frankie Yale. In addition to his criminal aspirations, Capone worked legitimate jobs as well. He was a bowling alley pin boy, a munitions factory paper cutter, and candy store clerk. It would seem that Capone enjoyed that candy a little bit too much, as it is known that he was overweight for the majority of his life. Capone could be described as nothing if not a man of appetites, but this did not only apply to food and liquor, but also women. When Torrio helped Capone secure a job with his New York associate Frankie Yale at the Harvard Inn as a bouncer and bartender, Capone's criminal career would finally begin to take off. But not before his personality got him into hot water. The story goes that in 1917, a female patron of the Harvard Inn, Lena Galluccio, caught Capone's eye, who did not realize that she was with her brother, Frank Galluccio. Galluccio was a criminal himself, and there with his sister and his date. Galluccio was very drunk, and he heard Capone speak up and make a less than polite comment about how he admired Lena's derriere. "You got a nice honey, and I mean that as a compliment." Lena's brother was furious. Capone tried to apologize, but Galluccio drew a knife, and in an attempt to slash his jugular, Galluccio swung the knife at Capone, but missed the mark due to his inebriated state, and sliced Capone's face instead. This left Capone with a scar that would stay with him for the rest of his life and earn him the nickname Scarface, which he despised. Al Capone much preferred his other nickname Snorky, meaning fashionable or a sharp dresser, to the more famous Scarface. Capone was always embarrassed about his scars and would try hard to take pictures only on his good side or cover the scars with his hand or a handkerchief. He would tell everybody that he had gotten the scars during his time in the service in World War I. Al Capone never served in the military. One would think that this would have taught Al Capone a lesson in being too forward with women, but one would be wrong. While attending a dance in 1918, Capone would meet his future wife Mary, or May as she preferred to be called. 9 months later, May would be giving birth to Capone's first and only child that we know of, Albert Francis Capone Jr. Capone Jr. was often called Sonny, and would legally have his name changed to Albert Francis Brown in 1966 to remove the Capone connection. May Coughlin had been born into a middle-class Irish immigrant family in Brooklyn, and was 2 years older than Al Capone. 3 weeks before their wedding, May Coughlin gave birth to their one and only child. Al Capone and May Coughlin were married on December 30th, 1918 at St. Mary's Star of the Sea Church in Brooklyn. At this time, being an Italian man marrying an Irish girl would have been seen as an increase in status, so it's likely that Capone's family was excited about the union and the baby boy. Now, how May's family felt about it, I'm not sure. Some have suggested that Capone's mother knew May from church and had arranged the marriage. Just as a quick aside, since this might have been something that you've heard, Al Capone's great-niece, Deidre Capone, claims that May Coughlin was not the biological mother of Al Capone's son. This seems unlikely due to the circumstances that surrounded the rushed marriage. This is also sort of out of character for May Capone, who was Irish-born, educated, and a devout Catholic. Why would she be in such a hurry to marry a man like Al Capone? But this question of maternity is worth noting. On their marriage certificate, May Coughlin took 2 years off of her age, and Al Capone added one to his, making them both listed as 20 when they were wed. The next year in 1919, Capone would be arrested, then discharged for disorderly conduct at the Harvard Inn before being called to Chicago by Johnny Torrio to work as a brothel bouncer on the eve of the 18th Amendment fallout. Capone agreed to move his family to Chicago. It was at this job as a brothel bouncer that Capone would contract syphilis. This illness would be passed on to his wife, and the couple's future attempts to have children would be stifled by the disease, resulting only in miscarriages and stillbirths. Capone continued to prove himself as trustworthy and loyal to Torrio. When the Chicago boss, Big Jim Colosimo, had made the decision to stay out of the bootlegging business, Torrio knew that he had to go. Colosimo had already lost his edge by falling head over heels for his much younger second wife, and his refusal to make a fortune with illegal liquor proved to be the last straw for Torrio. On May 11, 1920, after returning from his honeymoon at West Baden Springs Resort in West Baden, Indiana, a resort which Al Capone would also come to enjoy, Colosimo was murdered at his cafe. Many suspect that Al Capone might have been one of the triggermen or masterminds behind the attack. With that fatal move, Johnny Torrio became the boss of Chicago's South Side Gang, and Al Capone, who was only 21 years old, became Torrio's underboss and second in command. In his position as underboss, Capone would get to work expanding his bootlegging network, specifically smuggling bootlegged liquor in from Canada and moving moonshine from the country's Midwest. Both of these operations were overseen by his brothers Ralph and Frank Capone. Fun fact, Al Capone's eldest brother Vincenzo was actually a law enforcement officer in Idaho who heard all about his brother's criminal exploits through newspapers. He changed his name to Richard James Hart to avoid the family shame. Capone would spend most of his time in Chicago, overseeing the many speakeasies he controlled in the area, although he always loved vacationing in Florida whenever possible. He would also make frequent stops in Tennessee between Florida and Chicago, where many of the moonshining operations took place. By 1929, he had funded the construction of the High Point Mansion in Mont Eagle, Tennessee, fully outfitted with escape hatches on the roof and underground tunnels in the basement. Today, the High Point is a popular restaurant, tourist location, and event venue. In addition to West Baden, Indiana, Mont Eagle, Tennessee, and Miami, Florida, Capone had several retreats he frequented throughout the United States, including but not limited to Brookfield, Wisconsin, St. Paul, Minnesota, Olean, New York, Terre Haute, Indiana, Dubuque, Iowa, Hot Springs, Arkansas, Johnson City, Tennessee, and Lansing, Michigan. It is reported that with the sale of illegal liquor, the Capone was earning an annual income of $60 million. That would be about $189 million per year today. This income would continue to grow, and at the height of his career, it was reported that he was earning an income of $100 million per year, or $1.5 billion today. This operation would make him an extremely rich man, in addition to an extremely powerful one. With the exception of a traffic violation in 1923 that would be discharged, Capone was reaping the rewards of the sale of illegal liquor while standing on the foundation of Chicago's long-established political corruption. This traffic violation, by the way, was a little bit more than performing a rolling stop at a stop sign. Capone had been drinking in August of 1922, and while speeding along North Wabash Avenue, he crashed into a parked taxi while the driver was still inside. He then jumped out of his car, brandishing his revolver while threatening to shoot not only the taxi driver, but anyone else around. He would be charged with assault with an automobile, driving while intoxicated, and carrying a concealed weapon. This never went to trial, and Capone was able to avoid the charges. However, it wasn't all fun and games during this era. Several bootlegging competitors had tried to thwart Capone's operation, but only one man was really able to come along and resist him. I speak, of course, of Dino Banyan, the head of the smaller but very organized Irish crew on the north side of Chicago. The Northsiders became a real thorn in the side of the Southsiders, who would have otherwise had free reign in Chicago. O'Banion was constantly crossing and double-crossing the Southside gang and making Capone's blood boil. Capone wanted to take O'Banion out right away, but Torrio refused and tried to make peace. When that peace deal fell through, and O'Banion had tricked Torrio into spending $500,000 to buy out his distillery, which he knew would be raided that day, and got Torrio arrested for his trouble, Torrio joined Capone in his desire to see O'Banion wiped off the map. But nothing could be done until the president of the Unione Siciliana, Mike Merlo, had passed away. Merlo had insisted that the North and South Side gangs work out their differences for the sake of keeping a low profile. Merlo knew that if the federal government got involved, it would spell disaster for their operations. Mike Merlo would die of cancer on November 8, 1924. Dino Banyan would die as a result of multiple gunshot wounds just 2 days later on November 10, 1924. It is undeniable that Al Capone was one of the masterminds behind this attack, and probably among the most joyful when he heard the news about O'Banion's death. He sent an enormous bouquet to O'Banion's funeral. Torrio and Capone had called their mutual associate Frankie Yale to Chicago to pull the trigger on O'Banion, and Yale was able to wiggle out of the charge himself before returning to New York. All of this had also shocked Capone into the realization that the power of the city was really held by the Unione Siciliana, and he would begin a back-and-forth battle with his smaller rival Joe Aiello for control of the Unione. This in itself resulted in several deaths until Capone was finally able to get his consigliere Antonio Lombardo into the driver's seat of the Unione from 1925 to 1928. However, Lombardo would be killed, and Capone would have to put in Pasqualino Lolorda. Lolorda would also be murdered, then replaced by Giuseppe Giunta, someone who was allied with Aiello and hated Capone just as much. Giunta would be murdered in 1929, and after that, Aiello would take over the Unione. Aiello teamed up with Northside leader Bugs Moran, who had taken over for Dino Banyan. Then he would take advantage of the fraying relationship between Capone and Frankie Yale. By the time it was all said and done, Aiello had teamed up with both Bugs Moran and Frankie Yale to go against Al Capone in not only the Unione Siciliana, but all of Chicago. Yale had supplied Capone with the majority of his Canadian whiskey, but Capone suspected a double-cross when Yale kept having these shipments hijacked. Capone sent his man James D'Amato to investigate. D'Amato reported to Capone that these shipments were being hijacked on purpose, and then he got caught. He tried but failed to shoot Yale and would be killed himself about a week later on July 7, 1927. This would mark the end of the Yale-Capone friendship. Capone had tried to mend this relationship by inviting Yale to join him in attending the Dempsey-Tunney heavyweight boxing match and giving Yale a diamond-studded belt buckle with his initials, one of Capone's favorite gifts to give to his friends, who would often end up double-crossing him and winding up dead. But the relationship had completely soured. Keep this in mind, and we're going to tie up this loose end a little bit later, but right now I want to get back to the fallout of Dino Banyan's death. Mike Merlo had been right in his prediction that murdering O'Banion would be the beginning of the end for the South Side's operations. After Dino Banyan was killed, George Bugs Moran took over as the boss of the North Side. He, along with fellow North Sider Earl Jaime Weiss, the only man Capone was ever known to have feared, began a revenge campaign on the South Side. This began the era of the Chicago Beer Wars and gang wars that plagued the city from the mid to late 1920s. The Illinois Crime Survey by Arthur Lely in 1930 reported, in the period between 1920 and 1927, over 400 gangsters had been killed by other gangsters and an additional 200 had been killed by the police. A large number of policemen had also been killed in the war with these armed desperados. Some of the conflicts between rival gangs and between gangsters and policemen were carried on with machine guns firing from automobiles racing through the streets. This all became too much for Johnny Torrio after he was attacked by the Northsiders and beaten nearly to death in 1925. If the gun placed to his head had not jammed when the trigger was pulled, Torrio would have likely died. Having survived, he handed control of the South Side to Capone and returned to New York. Capone was only 26 when he became the boss of the Chicago outfit. Legend has it that it's actually Capone who gave the Chicago outfit their name, saying that this was their outfit. I have no way of actually corroborating the story, but I really like it and I choose to believe it. There would be constant attempts on Capone's life, and he would be very careful. Fortunately, he had several trustworthy bodyguards, but most notably his confidant, head protector, and friend Jack McGurn, and Frank Rio, another trusted bodyguard and friend who was with Capone the day he was famously attacked at one of his headquarters in the Hawthorne Inn. His other headquarters was at the Lexington Hotel. At this point, the media actually responded pretty favorably to Capone, and Capone loved the public. He was viewed as a type of Robin Hood figure, especially as folks became more and more frustrated by prohibition laws. On September 26, 1926, Jaime Weiss led 11 cars by Capone's headquarters and fired over 1,000 machine gun rounds into the restaurant there, where Capone and his men were eating lunch. Frank Rio threw Capone to the ground and laid on top of him to cover until the barrage of bullets had stopped. Several bystanders were injured from the glass and bullet shrapnel. One of these victims was a little boy and his mother. The mother would have permanently lost her eyesight from the injury had Capone not paid for the best medical care to make sure that that did not happen to her. Thanks for both causing and solving that problem, Al. Within 3 weeks of the incident, Capone would have Jaime Weiss murdered. In 1926, when two of Capone's sworn enemies, James Doherty, a lead beer runner competitor in Cicero, and Thomas Duffy, a saloon owner not under Capone's thumb, were found in Cicero, and Capone ordered for them to be killed too. Capone did not realize, however, that William McSwiggan, a promising young prosecutor who had attempted to put Capone away for murder in 1924, was accompanying them, and they were all three shot and killed. McSwiggan's murder would completely bust the bubble of public favor for Al Capone. It was a national story, and Capone was immediately blamed, even though he would insist that McSwiggan was a friend and on his payroll. Although the public was now furious with Capone, he was never charged for the crime. However, before the case was dismissed for Capone, law enforcement had raided several of his businesses and found evidence that would eventually serve as proof of tax evasion in 1931. After that close call, Capone called for a truce. Capone, Moran, and their men came to an agreement on October 21, 1928, after meeting at the Hotel Sherman to work out territory disputes and put an end to the violence. The federal government was beginning to take notice of Chicago, and both Capone and Moran knew that it would be impossible to get anything done with the federal government involved in their business. This Hotel Sherman treaty lasted for less than a year. In response, Al Capone beefed up his security, including a 24/7 detail at the Lexington Hotel in anticipation of further bloodshed. Even before all of this, he had ordered a 7-ton bulletproof Cadillac in which he would be safely transported around town. In 1927, Capone donated $500,000 to his friend William Hale Thompson to run for mayor of Chicago. Thompson won in a landslide, allowing for Capone to enjoy a Chicago back in his control. Interesting fact, the city of Chicago has never seen a Republican mayor since Thompson. Capone invested in newspapers and the media, and, well, the newspapers and media invested right back into him. He was a media sensation. Any headline with Al Capone included in it sold like hotcakes. He was one of the first mobsters to love the spotlight and was willing to pay reporters and cops handsomely to treat him favorably. He was a celebrity don. When he went to baseball games, one of his favorite pastimes. He would sign just as many autographs as the baseball players themselves. During school Christmas celebrations, he would portray Santa Claus and give out thousands of dollars worth of goodies to Chicagoans. He would then move his headquarters to Metropole, where he would rent several rooms and run gambling and prostitution rings. Al Capone could be described as many things, but never stingy. Despite the seeming victory Capone was enjoying in 1927, he had no idea that on May 16, 1927, the Supreme Court was ruling on a case named U.S. v. Sullivan that concluded that gains from illicit traffic in liquor are subject to income tax. Another interesting thing about Capone is that by the late 1920s, he was warning people against investing in the stock market, calling it a racket. He would know. Now, before we get too much farther, I want to make sure that we tie up that loose end about Frankie Yale and the Unione Siciliana. In 1928, Capone's Unione Siciliana boss, Tony Lombardo, would be taken out. His man Pasqualino Lolordo would take over for a short time before he too was killed. Now that everything had cooled off from the McSwiggan murder, Capone was able to exact revenge on Frankie Yale for not only double-crossing him with the bootleg liquor, but double-crossing him with Aiello. Yale was killed by Capone's men on July 1st, 1928. After Lolordo's death, Giuseppe Giunta would take over for less than a year in 1929 and oppose Capone, conspiring to have him killed using assassins John Scalise and Albert Anselmi. After that fell through, Capone invited the three of them to dinner at the Hawthorne Hotel, where he or one of his men beat them to death with a baseball bat. Capone's rival Joe Aiello would then gain control of the Unione. Torrio would come out of retirement to help Capone create a peace deal with Aiello, and for a time, Capone had to swallow the medicine of having Aiello as boss of the Unione. Meanwhile, the Hotel Sherman Treaty was long dismissed, and Capone was dealing with the violence of the North Siders. While Capone was vacationing in Florida in February, the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre hit took place in Chicago. Although it is associated with Al Capone and the national media was quick to point their finger at Capone, he was never charged for the crime. That doesn't mean he didn't do it. Many believe that Al Capone, with the assistance of Jack McGurn, had plotted out the hit and made sure that Capone was well away from the deed when it was done. It was described by U.S. Attorney George E.Q. Johnson as the most amazing crime in Chicago's amazing criminal history. Al Capone, if he was behind it, intended to kill George Moran by setting up a fake whiskey hijacking on himself and having one of his men call Moran and ask if he wanted to buy the stolen liquor and have it delivered to his warehouse at the SMC Cartage building the next day. Moran agreed, probably thinking that this was too good to be true. It was. On February 14, 1929, Moran was walking into the warehouse when he saw police officers entering the warehouse. He stayed back and did not go inside, assuming his men were being arrested in a raid. These were not officers, but Capone assassins, who lined Moran's men up against the back wall and fired into them with machine guns, killing all 7, before running back to their fake police cruiser and speeding off. This would be the most infamous hit in Chicago's criminal history, and would serve as the final blow to the North Side, which from that point forward would fizzle out and eventually disappear. Moran had said to reporters regarding the massacre, "Only Capone kills like that," to which Capone had fired back to reporters, "The only man who kills like that is Bugs Moran." In 1929, Capone was arrested in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, after just being released on bond for refusing to appear in court. Late in 1927, Capone had said he was suffering from pneumonia and could not appear in court, but then evidence emerged proving that he had been vacationing in the Bahamas. He was arrested, then released on bond, only to be rearrested in Philadelphia for carrying a concealed weapon. He was sentenced to 1 year behind bars, but would serve only 9 months before being released early on good behavior. While Capone was put away, Aiello saw this as an opportunity to weaken his rival. Aiello would attempt and fail to take out hits on Capone's bodyguards Jack McGurn and Phil DeAndrea. When Capone was released and realized what Aiello had done, he gave the go-ahead to wipe Aiello off the map. Joe Aiello was killed on October 23, 1930. Capone would then place his man Agostino Loverdo as head of the Unione, making him the last appointment to affect Al Capone. After the Philadelphia weapon arrest, Chicago law enforcement was embarrassed on the national stage. How long had Capone been terrorizing that city, and no justice was ever served, yet he steps 1 foot into Philadelphia and is immediately met with repercussions? To be fair, it's not as if Capone had the book thrown at him in Philadelphia. He was released early, and it's from this sentence that we see the pictures of his posh jail cell, where he could basically do whatever he wanted at Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary. Even still, this was way more justice than he had ever been served in Chicago, but it was but a foretaste of what was coming down the pipeline. In November of 1930, Al Capone opened a soup kitchen for those suffering from unemployment and starvation during the Great Depression, which was caused by the crash of that racket of a stock market he had been talking about. This served not only the neediest of Chicago, but Al Capone himself. After that refusal to appear in court and the Philadelphia charge, Capone needed a PR boost, and this was just the way to do it. While the soup kitchen didn't blatantly display Capone's name, he made sure that his name was tied to it in all of the newspapers. The poor citizens on Chicago's South Side thought fondly of their criminal benefactor. However, Capone's good deed was not enough to outweigh the scales of the justice system. The Philadelphia case was just the first chord in a symphony of law enforcement that was about to come down on Al Capone. President Herbert Hoover had insisted after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre that the federal government do something about Chicago, specifically Al Capone. With the evidence found from the McSwiggan murder forward, federal law enforcement would lob several charges against Al Capone, including 22 counts of federal tax evasion, to which Capone had said, they can't collect legal taxes from illegal money. Apparently he didn't get the memo about U.S. versus Sullivan. Despite all of this, Capone had believed that he would get out of this one, just like all the rest, and agreed to a plea bargain in exchange for a 2.5-year sentence. To Capone's surprise, the judge refused to agree to this deal, and Capone had to try to scramble to take back his confession, but the case went to trial. Capone was left with only one tactic, and that was to intimidate or bribe the jury, which he did successfully. Unfortunately for Capone, the judge was pretty slick, and just before the trial began, switched out the entire jury. Capone was found guilty and sentenced to an unheard of 11 years in federal prison, in addition to $215,000 of due back taxes, court costs, and a $50,000 fine. He appealed and was denied a rehearing. Capone was sent first to the Atlanta Penitentiary for 2 years where, just like in Philadelphia, he bribed the prison officials to make his stay more comfortable. However, when he was found out, Capone was transferred to Alcatraz. The warden, James Aloysius Johnston, had the following exchange with Capone. Johnston asked Capone for his name, to which Capone replied, "You know who I am." Johnston answered, "Here you are now known as AZ-85. Capone would later admit, "It looks like Alcatraz has got me licked." He would work many jobs at Alcatraz while the syphilis he had contracted all those years ago was beginning to impact his mental capacity. The neurosyphilis would cause dementia in the 33-year-old man. In January of 1935, Capone was attacked in the shower room by James Lucas, a Texas murderer who claimed that Capone had threatened to kill him. He had attacked Capone with a pair of scissors, slicing his chest and hands. Later, Lucas would attempt to escape from the prison but fail. In 1937, Capone appealed his sentence to the district court, claiming the verdict had been inconsistent. This appeal was also dismissed. After serving 6.5 years, Capone was released to a mental hospital in Boston to serve out the rest of his term. He would remain in the mental hospital for 3 years before his health had declined so rapidly that he was released to live out the remainder of his days in Miami, Florida with his wife and family. Many suspect, even to this day, that Capone was faking his symptoms, but I just don't believe that that's the case. Before he died, his physician determined that his mind had deteriorated such that he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. Even with all of his crime and time in and out of federal prison, his wife and mother remained with him through his dying days. Alphonse Gabriel Capone would die from cardiac arrest resulting from pneumonia on January 25, 1947, just over a week after his 48th birthday. He had been struggling to breathe since January 21st and was sustained on oxygen until his passing 4 days later. The family refused to permit an autopsy so that his brain and body would remain in one piece for the burial. The body was sent to Florida's largest funeral home at the time, Philbrick's Funeral Home, and placed in the Philbrick Chapel for viewing the next day. Capone's wife and mother did not attend the first day of the viewing. The days of the $15,000 casket of the 1920s had long passed, and Al Capone was placed in a $2,000 bronze casket. No flowers were presented the first day, but the second day saw the chapel filled with flowers, including a 7-foot cross made of flowers. The media reported that his funeral service was to be held at the Patrick's Roman Catholic Church, where his wife attended on January 29th. But this was not true. Al Capone, due to his criminal history, was denied a requiem mass. His funeral was held at the Philbrick Chapel. His body was placed in a vault at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, while his grave was being dug in the city's frozen ground. Eventually, on February 4th, 1947, his body was removed from the vault and placed in a grave alongside his brother Salvatore and his father Gabriele. The monument would be knocked down several times by rowdy tourists, much to the family's frustration. Later, after his mother and other family members had passed, Capone's body was moved, along with all of his family members, to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Racket Reviews discussing the most famous mobster of all time, Al Capone. He is my favorite mobster and my favorite mobster to study, and maybe it's cliche to like the most popular one, but he had a certain je ne sais quoi that could not be denied. He was not the most intelligent, although he surrounded himself with brains that could do the work. He was not the most handsome, although there was something about him. The most prudent, although that seemed to serve him well. And by no stretch of the imagination was he the most private. He was the first media don, and he was quite the sensation. He really set the mark for what that don looks like and gave us an insight into the mafia that we never saw before him. Make sure to let me know in the comment section below or on Facebook and Twitter what you think about Al Capone. I know that there are several little side stories or things that we didn't get to cover in the episode today, and I would love to have a further discussion with you about Big Al. Also, don't forget to utilize the comment section in social media to let me know who you would like to see covered next. I always love hearing from you, and I'm always happy to investigate. Make sure to like, subscribe, and click notifications to get more Mafia content sent directly to your subbox. Ciao.